when David first wrote to me to ask me to give this talk, I was panicking slightly that I wouldn't have anything useful to say. But as I began thinking about my own work and how it might relate to education, I realised that I probably do think about education quite a lot, both in the day-to-day sort of way, but also metaphysically, not least from working on Plato's Phaedrus, and there the kind of really early discussions of dialectic and what it means for the relationship between a pupil and a teacher, and particularly a philosopher. So thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the chance to think more directly about education. And the AI bit, I didn't really mean to start talking about AI, but it sort of grew as I began thinking about this paper, and particularly the question of creativity. And I guess it's something we're all beginning to think about in a much more sharp way. There's been so much more in the media about the problem of AI that I thought it'd be a good moment anyway for me to think about it and try to be positive whilst also on guard. And so I don't think I'll be either positive or negative in the end about AI, but hopefully there'll be something here that we can perhaps discuss afterwards in relation to the kind of problems of AI. So through this talk, I'm going to explore some earlier writers who were worried about new technologies. One being Plato, with the invention of writing, as discussed between Phaedrus and Socrates in the dialogue called the Phaedrus. More positively, there's Arnaud and Nicole, who were really alarmed by the developments of Cartesian philosophy and found the microscope to open up a new kind of mystery in the face of the Cartesian extended landscape. So there is a technology that actually reintroduces mystery. And then David Jones, and some of you may have a copy of a poem by David Jones in front of you, with his perfected steel, and I might read that out in a moment as a kind of context for what follows. And then also I will mention Margaret Masterman, the remarkable Cambridge philosopher who found an extraordinarily theological way of looking at the computer. And so I shall try to bring positive and negative and try to explore how we're going to negotiate this really difficult landscape with artificial intelligence, and especially in the context of the crisis of humanities and of course the geopolitical crisis, which is just pouring out in different ways in front of us every day. So I'll begin by reading this poem, which hopefully you probably already know this poem. And I doubt, well, the reason I'm going to read it out is because perhaps you haven't read it thinking about artificial intelligence before. So I shall read it in that context. So R. Domine Deus, it's by David Jones, and as you can see it was written in 2 sittings. The poetic bit, the sort of first 2/3 of it, were written in 1938, and then it drops into prose, and that later bit was written in 1966. I said, what shall I write? I inquired up and down. He's tricked me before with his manifold lurking places. I looked for his symbol at the door. I have looked for a long while at the textures and contours. I have run a hand over the trivial intersections. I have journeyed among the dead forms causation projects from pillar to pylon. I have tired the eyes of the mind regarding the colours and lights. I have felt for his wounds in nozzles and containers. I have wondered for the automatic devices. I have tested the inane patterns without prejudice. I have been on my guard not to condemn the unfamiliar, for it is easy to miss him at the turn of a civilization. I have watched the wheels go round in case I might see the living creatures like the appearance of lamps, in case I might see the living God projected from the machine. I have said to the perfected steel, be my sister, and for the glassy towers, I thought I felt some beginnings of his creature. But Domine Deus, my hands found the glazed work unrefined, and the terrible crystal a stage paste. Ea Domine Deus. So I'll be coming back to that during my talk. So over the past couple of years, I have worked as the academic lead for an arts and humanities curriculum development project in Cambridge. Our brief being to understand better the reasons for the decline in school pupils applying to study humanities subjects at Cambridge and how to try to offset it. The project took us beyond Cambridge. We interviewed school pupils across the UK, their parents, sixth form advisors, teachers, employers, as well as current and recent students. The discussions brought so many surprises. Although numbers of humanities applicants are declining dramatically, and school pupils indeed spoke with regret about being persuaded by their schools to study STEM subjects at university, the passion for humanities is not waning in those individuals who have chosen these subjects. And indeed it was voiced with quite subtle and disarming awareness of the importance of humanities subjects in helping us to address the geopolitical and increasingly ontological crises of our day. This surprised us because we felt that school pupils, would be assuming that the only way to confront those crises would be from a STEM direction. But there was such an extraordinary articulate sense amongst sixth formers that we interviewed that humanities held the key to change. And that was really exciting. So although we were dealing with a depressing small number, nonetheless, those that were committed were really committed and actually quite pioneering. They spoke of the subjects in ways that we hadn't thought of. One striking conclusion from our discussions with current and recent graduates is that students really don't want to divide humanities subjects in the way that traditional universities have tended to do, so separating English, classics, theology, modern and medieval languages and so forth, and that nothing is off the table in terms of viable disciplines and viable methodologies. Theology, interestingly, is seen as much a viable theory as, say, deconstruction or the new materialism. Poetry is seen by this generation as being as much a mode of lucidity as plain speech or the plain speech of science. Students in my own faculty have developed and established a journal designed precisely to test the boundaries of academic discourse, writing responses to philosophico-theological problems, sometimes in verse form, in dialogue form. Some of them have developed installations and films and musical compositions and performances. So where our examining curriculums don't really reward this kind of work, and certainly undergraduates don't have any creative component, sadly, in the course we offer. Nonetheless, the students are showing us the way, really setting an example of how we need to start thinking differently and acting differently. The pupils and current students focusing on STEM subjects spoke also of continuing to study literature even whilst doing their degrees in science, in the natural sciences, and of wishing that their degree gave more time and recognition to the learning of languages and the studying of the arts. Pupils and students spoke of exploded disciplines and of wanting, above all, to learn how to read reality, to become better readers of reality, better hermeneutes. Our statistical samples felt quite massive at the time. We had a very small team, and of course is tiny in the broader scheme of things, but it gave us huge encouragement to pursue a greater boldness on the part of educators, that somehow a boldness is needed in testing the genres of academic formation, pushing our own discourses in new directions, placing greater value on new academic idiolects and modes of thought that might have until recently been seen as perhaps less scientific in character. We need to expand the canon to include non-standard sources, field notes, letters, video footage, and ask new kinds of questions, perhaps even questions which can't be answered. I'm worried about saying that now, because much of what I'm going to say is going to be about unanswerable questions, and I'm worried about your useful learning banner at the front and whether, in fact, I'm promoting not useful learning as a kind of useful learning. Perhaps it will work. So 2 texts accompanied my thinking during the curriculum development project. One was Plato's Phaedrus, not just for its critique and discouragement of sophistry or trying to get sort of quick ends in sort of capitalistic ways, and its critique of demythologization, trying to simplify the myths, but also for its discussions of the invention of the technology of writing and its recommendation of seemingly foolhardy open searching for the highest realities, or in more earthly, mundane terms, its searching for the impossible. The philosopher-lover of Socrates' second speech in the Phaedrus is referred to as mad, insane, for his ardent and anguished searching for a glimpse of beauty in the physical world. Phaedrus describes Socrates as strange and barbaric, for going barefoot on their walk along the river, testing the temperature of the water and attending to the strange local myths of Boreas and so forth. These Socratic investigations are rejected by the crude sophist Phaedrus for being excessive, profligate, not useful. Yet one senses by the end that it is precisely in these mythical detours that the path of the good will reveal itself. And so I suggest an analogy pertains between the invention of writing, the later invention perhaps of movable print or the movable type of the printing press, and the arrival of artificial intelligence today. The other text in my mind was the poem by David Jones that we've just read, not so much for its seeming pessimism, because it does seem to lament all the way through with these repeated I inquired, I looked, I have looked, I've run my hand, this sort of exorbitant thoroughness, I really tried to find this symbol, this sign in the world around him. But I was interested in this ambivalent final doxology, hovering halfway between lamentation and almost a greeting, Ea Domine Deus. It's very ambiguous. And that sort of ambivalent greeting, I think, is perhaps the way I would like to try to position myself in relation to some of the things in terms of artificial intelligence that worry me nonetheless. So I'll be returning to those 2 texts. So I would like to explore further the idea that as educators, we may have failed in our Socratic task to encourage the asking of impossible questions. Perhaps from a very young age, we've discouraged perhaps a sort of pedagogical barefootedness of somehow making things plainer, simpler, more orderly than we needed to, and failed to question the genres in which we speak and write, perhaps partly in academic terms, but also in terms of textbooks, how we might design and write textbooks. And I wonder whether in our sort of discourses we have cast a shadow over the value of what I might call asymptotic hermeneutics, the idea that somehow we never really get to the end of what we're trying to understand, and somehow the way that we present our work seems to devalue that idea that things might be never-ending, but therefore all the more valuable for that openness. Has this failure, in turn, deterred young people from diverse backgrounds to see themselves as represented in what we do? Is the content of our education falsely presented as somehow a kind of certainty or a stronghold, or something that can be defended and is pure? I realise this evening that I'm not addressing theologians, so I will avoid straightforward sort of theological discourse and try to mediate what I might have put differently in other contexts. But I think I can use the word apophatic safely, this idea that somehow knowing is about unknowing. One might speak then of a kind of apophatic searching, assuming some kind of, I would call it a metaphysics of participation, but a view that somehow the world around us isn't empty, and the value of what we see in it or gain from it is not nullified if we can't get to the end of it. That somehow that incompleteness has a disclosive quality that is incredibly important, and has that been extirpated by the way we present learning and the way that we as academics write our work, devaluing that incomplete understanding. So I cannot help thinking it might usefully inform a mode of inquiry that might be relevant to non-theological frameworks as well, one that is never satisfied that its job has been done. And I'm not proposing a kind of nihilism here that assumes that each layer of realization is just a mask or some kind of empty effort that's purely ironic in character. Rather, somewhat like the philosopher-lover of the Phaedrus, I think this might be an area in which theology actually has an advantage over some other disciplines, in its being almost pathologically unafraid to ask absurd questions, unembarrassed to see value in incompleteness. This is why I believe the university is in peril if it abandons theology. Thinkers such as Thomas Kuhn and Paul Feyerabend have pointed out how even the seemingly hard sciences are historically subject to a paradigm shift, which is not always rationally motivated. Earlier thinkers such as Whitehead and Collingwood also saw this, but did not despair of the search for metaphysical truth. Collingwood saw that commitment to a metaphysic, as never entirely provable, belongs to an understanding of the important questions being unanswerable, and yet providing a direction. The danger is that without embracing the unanswerable horizon, as for Schelling, we end up like the idolaters of Deutero-Isaiah. We can never reach the answers, and yet must seek them. In this way, a theological incompleteness safeguards truth as such, but also safeguards openness and tolerance. Something of that absurd ardour and restless searching is expressed by Antoine and Arnaud and Pierre Nicole in their Logic, or the Art of Thinking, written in response to the epistemology of René Descartes and his notion of matter as extension or undifferentiated stuff. And I will read this passage out as well. So they're very worried about Descartes, they're contemporaries of his, and they are trying to create a sort of scientific mystery. They say this: how can we comprehend that the smallest grain of matter is infinitely divisible, and that we can never reach a part so small that it not only contains many others, but also an infinity, that the smallest grain of wheat contains in itself as many parts, though proportionately smaller, as the whole world, that all imaginable forms are actually found in it, and that it contains in itself a small world with all its parts, a sun, a heaven, stars, planets, a world, with admirable exactness of proportions, and that there are none of the parts of that grain which do not still themselves contain another proportional world. What must be the part in so small a world which answers to the size of a grain of wheat? And what a tremendous difference must there be in order that we may be able to say truly that what a grain of wheat is in relation to the whole world, that part is in relation to a grain of wheat. Nevertheless, that part, whose littleness is already incomprehensible to us, contains still another world proportional, and so on to infinity, without our being able to find any which has not as many relative parts as the whole world, however numerous these may be. So this is an asymptotic search, which is animated by the constantly receding horizon that leaves them breathless, really, with wonder. And this was the landscape opened up for them by the microscope. And so they're using, in a way, this new facility or technology to augment what they can see and to offset the idea that somehow physical matter is drained of mystery that Descartes has been promoting. The not reaching of a final conclusion is, for Arnaud and Nicole, not a humiliation of effort, but disclosive of the sought-after truth in its constant arrival and its receding. And it tells us something of what they thought the nature of truth was, as uncontainable, as unsurpassable. So it often feels as though there is a mismatch between the way it feels to live in the world, the way we generally act within it, as if there were a soul, as if there were freedom, as if there were beauty and the good and the real, when the scientific frameworks encouraged by so much of our world today tend to cast doubt on truth, though it depends upon it. A.N. Whitehead in Modes of Thought is useful here for his outline of the way in which a certain kind of experimental science sees as true only what can be measured by mathematics and repeated by experiment, casting the knowing subject as a kind of pristine window of awareness upon the matter, following Descartes, even if it acknowledges that our minds and emotions belong to nature. But this means only looking at the world in a detached or constative mood, as if it were over there, like the brute fact of Descartes' extensio in the Meditations. The philosophers of science, Simon Shapin and Stephen Schaffer, in their Leviathan and the Air Pump, have shown how the production of matters of fact in the 17th century in fact involved a construction or theatre of truth which depended on repeatability as a criterion of truth and a specific kind of constructed spectacle, as well as a suppression or occlusion of any vagaries. What can we know within this rationally constructed enclave? Only one's own reflection in the pool of a confined reality. The Italian philosopher Andreas Bellantone has argued that this construal of knowledge as correspondence issues in narcissism and melancholia. Narcissism because all that one knows for such a scheme is one's own mirrored categories, and melancholia issues because one has, by definition, then been cut off from that asymptotic horizon, from the plenitude of reality for which one mournfully longs. So for Whitehead and Bellantone and others, classical experimental science, if it sees itself as the only mode of access to truth, assumes a meaningless world as objective truth, reflecting back to us the categories we impose on it, and occludes the thrall of plenitude and the complex moods in which reality arrives. It cannot give an account of why there are conscious creatures who spontaneously find meaning in nature, and so identify themselves in a fully mythical rather than a narrowly scientific mode. By mythical, I mean a sense of the way in which our imaginative powers are in continuity with, complete and manifest nature's own self-creativity, as the critic poet Elizabeth Sewell has suggested. Thus we can only think the tree by identifying with it, and only think ourselves by identifying with the tree, and so forth. Yet we need a better natural philosophical framework that can account for our sense of beauty and our sense of the good, as well as for consciousness, feeling and free will, and not discount these as epiphenomenal. For the feeling of their irrelevance or disruptiveness is negatively shaping, and also can tell how much it somehow contributes to the larger scale and distortions that might surround us and be communicated by us. In the same way, we need also to find a way to articulate negative modes, disruptive ones, turbulence, anguish, and indeed melancholy, for these sensations and feelings are also forms of knowing, which are part of our lived reality and have been just as much extirpated as the delight or euphoria of some kind of search. Why should not the engaged moods of warm feeling or euphoria or melancholy also disclose reality, as much as the cool and detached gaze of the Cartesian sage? For cold syllogism or formal logic can be perfect, yet tell us nothing about reality. For logic to do this, we have to isolate realities and what realities belong with other realities as genera and species and so forth. Yet this isolating can be as much a matter of the fume of euphoric feeling as of indifferent gazing or manipulation. We have no reason to exclude tempered feeling as part of a guide to classification. With regard to imponderable questions, it seems, for example, that we will never explain consciousness, parce denet. But what if we start to allow that degrees of consciousness are in everything, through the perpetual communication of information and mutual offering? It seems increasingly that there is no pure mechanical causality. Each thing prehends, following Whitehead, what precedes it, and surrounds it, and interprets it. Even a machine is organic in its totality. It is equally possible to see our bodies as only interior spirits, manifesting to each other, casting a Gnostic suspicion on this exteriority, like Raymond Royer or Michel Henry, or to see interior spirit as merely a stoic incorporeal effect of a fold within the exterior corporeal surface, like Gilles Deleuze. Ultra-spiritual modernism or materialist postmodernism, but it is arguably less arbitrary to see both as equally true, as with the polar Trinitarian ontological vision of Schelling, Rosmini, Bulgakov, and implicitly Whitehead, for whom all of reality and each single reality is at once entirely a hidden interior core and entirely an expressive bodily outgoing. They are constantly united factors and yet constantly in dynamic tension. This is the third of spirit. All of reality and each reality moves in an endless spiral of in, out and beyond for Whitehead and Bulgakov, and there is obviously a Trinitarian subplot there which I haven't brought out on this occasion. One of the most unnerving aspects of artificial intelligence is its capacity to simulate or mimic or even possibly initiate the creative residue of human thought, a productivity that we might have assumed or hoped was unique to us as human beings. Is there a strange kind of natural theology here, even in our own artificial products, without needing to fantasize that machines will ever really think? Whatever the case here, AI means that we are more than ever captivated and captured by the technology of writing, and now by a writing that writes itself, even if human beings are at some atavistic moment the initiators of this script. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates explores what he calls the pharmakon, or strange medicinal facility of writing. It can mimic speech, but can only repeat it identically, never innovate. It is useful as a mnemonic or storage facility for data, but cannot answer back or create of its own. It is neutral in itself, but dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands. when it can occlude the progress of the soul, and it can lead to ontological collapse if it does fall into the wrong hands. We can mistake its simplicity and repository-like compendiousness for reality itself, or the sum of reality, and we can see its silence and stasis as a kind of version of eternity. We can somehow mistake its quiescence for some kind of higher reality or truth. Writing also, Phaedrus, Socrates implies in the Phaedrus, has no teleological lure, and it encourages the sense that knowledge can be condensed into containable items of fact, which then promote a certain understanding of knowledge as countable or stockpilable, somehow implicitly connected with commerce or money. It seems to bypass the deleteriousness of time. It seems to be able to shore itself up against time's passing. And it is morally worrying. It's interesting how Phaedrus carries the scroll of Lysias's speech under his cloak in a slightly nefarious way and pretends it's his own speech, rather as AI is so often being used to pass off, students use it to pass off their own work, as if they had written it with its telltale bold type and rather blank idiom. So artificial intelligence then may in many ways be seen as parallel with the technology of writing in that dialogue. The anxiety about the dangers of writing are so vividly rehearsed today in response to AI. Will it replace our creativity and our depth? Will it stop us thinking for ourselves? Will it replace the real so that we no longer remember to look beyond the skein of its artifice? Will we be relegated to the cave of Plato's Republic, mistaking shadows on the wall for reality itself, not even realizing that we are shackled in delusion and shadows? I would tend to share the concern of these and other related questions and find myself anxiously then going back to Jones's bleak repetitions. I have looked for a while at the textures and contours. And yet the poet still felt for his wounds in the trivial intersections, in case he might see the living God projected from the machine. It sometimes feels as though Jones reaches this negative conclusion by the end of the poem with that final lamentation. Is there some kind of inchoate finding or disclosure in the poem itself, in the lamentation, which, interestingly, you'll notice a funny sort of pencil line over the script there, a sort of cruciform shape to that poem. Is there disclosure of some higher kind in that desolation, in the desolation of that poem? If one adheres to some kind of participatory metaphysics, as Jones did as a Catholic, then who is to say where God can or cannot be perceived or projected? Who is to say that the machine can't somehow be disclosive, and where God cannot reach? Is that inchoate hopefulness in that final word something that we should take on board? Is it lamentation or is it a greeting? Mindful always of how writing, movable type, many of our technologies have led to profound disclosiveness and creativity. Insofar as AI seems to innovate creatively, indeed imperfectly for now, this does not necessarily imply something reductive, as for quantum physics perhaps, a spontaneous predilection for order, apparently beyond the pre-programmed, could arise for us. After all, nature has produced minds aiming for their ends. I'm thinking here of the amazing Platonic biologist Agnes Arber, who read the whole of sort of biological nature through Platonic philosophy. If you don't know her, I recommend her, strongly influenced by Whitehead. And our minds then, following Agnes Arber's work, have variously and collectively produced the world around us, and that for us means machines. It means pylons and artificial intelligence. AI seems to show almost a curious predilection at times for more beautiful solutions, something in that blankness of its style, beyond calculation. So it could be that even in automatic devices, in artificial machinic reality, insofar as it is part of nature, we see a reflection of natural teleology, even of some kind of inchoate plenitude. Its apparent sense of aiming may lie in nature before us and even in machines after us. This does not mean that artificial intelligence judges or is conscious, but it may perhaps be thought to have some kind of unconscious. All of this is entirely uncertain and hard to put into words without some kind of overstatement, and everything I say I then immediately disagree with when I'm writing or talking about AI. But like Jones, I'm eager not to overlook manifold lurking places and be on my guard at what is definitely the turn of a civilization, not to miss the newly articulated disclosures that might be happening around us. But perhaps it is rather that even artificial contrivances can start to reveal new aspects of reality, as it is also part of its panoply that is teleological and inventive, just as it seems to open itself up infinitely to our mental comprehension, both theoretical and practical. And who is to say what can or can't open up new aspects of reality when Jones seeks his wounds in the nozzles and containers, in the perfected steel? He finds only a terrible stage paste. But the poem is itself an artifaction, a written work, dropping into prose in the final stanza. And as I've mentioned, in its contrivance, the cruciform shape emerging from the narrow column of verse and longer crossbars, as well as in its thematic of lamentation and doxology at the end. In this way, perhaps, surprisingly, computing itself may bring us back to the poetic as irreducible. This was intimated by the remarkable 20th century philosopher Margaret Masterman, who studied under Wittgenstein, developing ideas on meaning, language, and context. She was one of the founders of the Cambridge Language Research Unit and was working on a language which would somehow lend itself to machine translation. So she was extraordinarily pioneering, working at a time when in Cambridge there was only one computer, which took up a whole room. For her, metaphor, ambiguity, emotive tone, and contextual resonance were elements that do not map neatly onto literal or propositional meaning. In her essay, The Thesaurus in Syntax and Semantics, she discusses how even the best semantic tools fall short when dealing with the richness of poetic language. She suggested that computational approaches can help to reveal patterns, but cannot fully grasp the irreducible complexity of poetic meaning. Like Wittgenstein, Masterman believed that meaning is use, and poetic language demonstrates this principle in its most complex form. Poetry uses language not just to refer constitutively by a kind of correspondence, but rather to evoke, suggest, and transform. Moreover, for Masterman, context is everything. She argued that machines struggle with contextuality, which is so central to poetry. For example, the same word in a poem can resonate differently depending on cultural, historical, or symbolic context, something that is hard to codify computationally. Though her model of the fan, a kind of incipient quantum computing, was able to summon vast combinatorial spaces, generating new candidates for meaning. In keeping with the early G.E. Moore, Masterman sidelined the linguistically concomitant binary expression of things in terms of subject and predicate, in favour of an ideogrammatic approach to a holistic picture, a fan or a spray of a thing, through its complex coordinates, near and far, causal, simultaneous, and consequent, via a kind of panoptic mythical mapping or archiving of the cascade of contingency. She argued that our understanding of coordination might be greatly extended by the use of machine intelligence, programmed through a subtler deployment of binary codes to look for asymmetrical cognates, far more subtle than binary alternatives. Although a computer could in such a way extend one's ideographic range, its usage was for Masterman more like that of a telescope, allowing the still humanly judging eye to see further, rather like the invention of writing for Plato as a key mnemonic device, or the microscope for Arnaud and Nicole. Such an ideographic approach, philosophically adjacent to Whitehead's fractal metaphysics, can seem to favour an alternative ultimacy of event and process rather than a static array of facts or a Cartesian extensio. One might here invoke a further theme in Masterman's writings, namely the idea that for both nature and language, the same thing is always being said and done, but with myriad tiny, irreducible variations. Following these sorts of ideas, I wonder if AI has something to offer, perhaps in terms of a disclosive capacity, which should not be discounted, even if, as for Plato, it cannot attain to the status of the writing on the soul of Socratic dialectic, the true interpersonal philosophy that he finally endorses. Just as the poet ends up feeling the poem has said something she did not know she was saying, as if words themselves had some kind of creative drive of their own, so it may be that quantum computing and AI can outrun even our own initiation. More generally, one could say that, like the human body, human language and all other contrivances in different ways could mediate between the internal processes of the human spirit and the internal processes of nature herself. In this context, on a more reductive view, our thoughts and words just represent given reality, seen as inert and indifferent. Correspondence theory I've already mentioned in passing, and constitutive modes of truth. Whitehead's notion of the bifurcation of nature introduced in the concept of nature describes the division of reality into two different kinds of existence: primary qualities, which are measurable objective properties such as mass, position, motion and extension, real properties of matter, as regarded by classical science, existing out there in the world, independent of observers. And then he identified secondary qualities such as colour, sound, taste, smell, subjective experiences, mental phenomena, existing only in the observer's mind, and not seen as part of the real world in the scientific framework. For Whitehead, the bifurcation of the world into mind-independent matter and mind-dependent experience is philosophically untenable. The division does not reflect how reality arrives to us, colourful, warm, noisy. And if one subtracts the secondary qualities in the name of fastidious science and rigour, like Descartes' clearness, clarity and distinctness, one treats reality with only part of it there, completely devoid of this whole kind of sphere of the way reality presents itself to us. And that incompleteness then must then be reconstructed in such a way that arbitrarily necessitates unnecessary subjective interference. It also presumes a metaphysical dualism which undermines the unified thrall of experience. So after all, how can spirit copy matter? And how can we say that our thoughts just copy but do not also modify reality if we only have access to reality via thoughts? I would follow Collingwood here. We simply cannot know that our thinking does not in some way change reality. Rowan Williams' recent book, The Edge of Words, recent 2014, he's written several more since then, develops an adjacent argument about words adding to reality that seems to grow from these Collingwood-Whitehead ideas of of thoughts modifying the way the world is. So we need some better theories of truth which extract the thrall of reality from itself, will carry us into delusion and melancholy. We need instead theories that are more participatory, asymptotic, theories which acknowledge processes within nature, theories that acknowledge the event of reality in our minds as parallel or as originally one, as Owen Barfield and Arujana have argued. Can we push our questions beyond decorous, hygienic limits? Can we reverse our terms or turn things upside down? When we see a rainbow, perhaps we collectively dream the rainbow into existence. Such a question is neither idealism nor realism, but both at once, as for R.W. Emerson. Also, when we know forms in nature migrate into our minds for Aristotle and Aquinas, here for them our body mediates as being both external in the world and internal as being in me. Language is born from these coincidences and exchanges between inner and outer for Aquinas, and such approaches license a kind of release from decorum, which I think has held us back. Moreover, if the constative or epistemological framework for reality really pertains, then we can be replaced easily by dead machines, like for like almost. What one can know within such a rationally constructive enclave may be ascertainable or describable, but so trivial that it evaporates. It is either exhausted by the factuality of things or their comprehensibility by the human mind, or perhaps both at once. It doesn't really matter. Deflation, as analytic philosophers put it, eventuates in both instances. And education for such a model of knowing would be reduced to an induction into our replaceability, or else it provides for our formation as machines, maintaining a subject-object dichotomy and a mode of knowing that supposes our role as agents to be purely active versus passive in voice, along with perhaps other trajectories of kind of denial and delusion, where really our agency as whole beings has been removed, whole aspects of our reality occluded. In fact, there is only really any point to education if there is a mystery or a higher good, or a reality to which machines and other beings approximate. If education is more than a preparation for our entry as knowing agents into a flattened landscape of extended matter, then this more irreducible quality of reality needs to be accepted. The knowledge that is irreducible, that cannot be contained in an arraignment of circumscribed matters of fact, is poetic, more than human perhaps, asymptotically receding, and is attained through a specific mode of knowledge, I think, which comes across in that passage by Arnaud and Nicole as desire, as emergence, as hope. There's a lot of ardour and hope in the philosopher-lover in Socrates' second speech in the Phaedrus as well, and not through a sort of indifferent, semilfactive transfer or speculative gaze, which, though it may of course include that as one of its many modes of knowing. Knowledge has then a practical dimension also. To act coherently, we have to plan and foresee and possess skills, though these always include a speculative dimension, because to know what to do, what action to take, as an individual or as a society, we have to ask what to aim for, what action to take, what surprising excess to hope for. But this is a kind of knowing which is also an unknowing, as well as a pre-knowing and a retrospection, in the sense that we must be reconciled to the surprise of what arrives, as never quite catching up with what we seek to know, but at the same time as half knowing the questions to ask, because we may always already have leapt over the barrier of our ignorance, and we must be sensitive to that. The meno-problematic in Plato, to know something new, we must already inchoately half know as a definition of ignorance, because our mental processes are creative as part of nature, we can always half anticipate what we later discover. Human beings, as part of nature, recollect the forms of things which hover between universality and particularity. Neither has priority, and thinking that they might do so immediately traps us into an immanent or reductive framework which encourages us to call off the search. So this must involve asking unanswerable questions, hurling ourselves at the impossible, like what is real, what is the good, what is the whole, are thoughts real? Does a thought add to the panoply of reality? Are words part of reality? We have to go beyond the merely given, the tautology of given fact, in the sense of simply restating or redescribing the same sameness. Rather, for a more Baconian or Whiteheadian or Collingwoodish view, we explain by finding generative processes, even if these are mysterious, and learn how to subvert the triumph of the given by never acquiescing or accepting that we've reached the final question or that our job has now been completed. There are two linked approaches to this. For Plato and Aristotle and Neoplatonism, as well as some Christian thinkers, philosophy tries to know how all the many finite things relate to the one infinite thing. This is an utterly impossible question, not least because the questioner herself is part of that whole that has to be known. But without this question, there is no philosophy. Philosophy has to explain how there is spirit and consciousness as well as matter. Otherwise, secondly, if we merely collect and transmit data on passing matter, exploring how we can curate it better or control it, we only need a scientific explanation, and even there, according to a reductive notion of science as a kind of traffic warden of the real. Yet because philosophy has to go beyond fact and has to guess about the whole or imagine there to be a whole, it needs poetry or something perhaps like religion, which is prepared to cast itself into the impossible by way of the real, or push words into the wrong places, to be prepared to rethink those places, how the whole of reality and truth disclose itself in an instant, or instance, in the life of an individual and in societies throughout history. Only an attempted complete speculative explanation is any sort of explanation at all, because without ultimate causes, we are only describing. Intermediate causes matter, and it is important that after Bacon, modern science and technology have explored them. But if we have no sense of why there are things at all, we are just really playing with buttons in the dark. Because of this, humanistic education, in the case of the West, requires literary critical reflection on poetry, a training in the impossible, as well as the reach of language and how to go beyond language, as well as philosophy. One might see philosophy as a kind of abstract poetry, and poetry as concrete or realized or lived philosophy. Because philosophy tries to see particulars in the whole, and poetry to see the whole in the particular, yet both are to a degree doing the task of the other, else we will have weak philosophy and trivial poetry. In the face of AI, we must invigorate a humanistic education with philosophy and poetry at the core to train ourselves in ontological irreducibility and the thrall of unknowability. We have seen that theology, philosophy, as well as other discourses within arts and humanities, as well as sciences, must coalesce. The interplay of denial and assertion within theology and philosophy applies to both, and both are a matter of language as poetry and of poetics. This places obligations on us in terms of education, teaching, and curriculum formation, as well as ethical frameworks for daily life, for which words have often been seen as extrinsic ornament remote from the fray of the real. But equally, it is not that religion or philosophy must be reduced to poetry or subdued into poetic form or the sometimes confining rules of prosody. but rather that we must see these disciplines as a poetic or even theurgic action of synergy, where the divine power or the unknowable acts in and through the natural and the human. Without words, nature rests in a monistic confinement for us. Rather, we must assume that our speaking sustains and perfects the self-expression and interrelating of things themselves. If meaning does not consummate the real, then there is no sense to meaning. But there are no rules for realizing meaning. It adds to the self-containment of substance, but it does so before the arrival of law, the latter being the sediment of poetic habit. So philosophy, like theology, realizes rigorously all that we cannot say, the limits of the interplay between substance and arbitrary action, as well as the need always existentially to decide, this decision being spirit most apparent in human life itself. Beyond this, there is empirical event of which philosophy must take notice and upon which it reflects. For theology, there are the positive names of God, divine revelation in natural evolution and all of human history. Philosophy and theology allow these names and yet return them to a negative mystery, and so to the potential of each new conversation to bring new disclosures and new possibilities. What happens to us in secularity when we lose trust in these disclosures and possibilities as the world hovers on the brink of geopolitical catastrophe from every angle? Is the technocratic West the perversion of the kinds of high vision Jones hoped to find in the machine, or Arno and Nicole saw revealed by the new technology of the microscope in their logic? Or can it be realigned with the perhaps liturgical redeeming of technology as poiesis? If we look carefully enough, might we see the living God projected from the machine, as for David Jones? To answer these questions, we need a more fluid model for their discussion. The boundaries between theology and philosophy, and between philosophy and literature, arose in the past for contingent reasons that perhaps no longer pertain. They arose specifically in the West and are only imposed upon other traditions, often with strain. The lack of these boundaries in some traditions that may involve mystical modes in philosophy and greater porosity between abstract and figurative modes of writing, and even between written word, sound, and image, challenges us to look to these contributions and reconsider the course of the Western legacy. Was its integrity undone in the course of time? In a situation of global diversity within the study of humanities generally and theology and religion more specifically, and yet a persisting commitment to particular settings of departments in localities within their own traditions, it is incumbent upon us to foreground the development of pedagogic method. The rigid divisions of the past, caught between serving of the churches in the case of theology and serving of the secular university, between critical historical studies on the one hand and committed and theoretical modes of reflection on the other, have lost their justification. If, as I've argued, philosophy and history are ultimately one in their mediation by the poetic, this is doubly the case. There can be no philosophico-theological reflection beyond the merely negative and ultimately tautological that does not also engage positively with all that has contingently occurred and arrived in nature and in human culture. Departments of theology and religious studies are arguably in a unique position to realise this and to demand a globalised approach to truth. At the same time, any more than an empirical approach to history must ask what are in the end metaphysical questions, both about the negative and critical possibility of what can occur, and about the local and ultimate significance of what has occurred. In short, we need to move towards a more comprehensive and inclusive sense of the scientific, which I say in the continental sense of that term. Such an endeavour has its protocols. There must be an atmosphere of generosity and free inquiry. But at the same time, there can be no tolerance for the dehumanizingly and deliberately offensive intended to sow the seeds of division and occlude the free speech of some but not others, nor for the propagandistic distortion of fact, now all too prevalent on social media. There is no room for the pernicious view that words are not actions. It is by pursuing a more ambitious, theoretical goal in a global and radically diverse social space that is genuinely open for theory and not distorted by economic influence, ideological blandishment, or falsely simplifying foreclosure, that the academic study of the humanities, literature, poetics, philosophy, and theology can make its own ultimately practical contribution to a just and peaceful human future. Thank you.